would like to tell people what two questions I'll be discussing for the 6 presentations that I have. They're very simple questions. Who was C.S. Lewis, and why bother with C.S. Lewis in the first place? To do this, I'll be touching upon Lewis's life, of course, which is an interesting life, upon his work, which is extremely varied, and upon his thought, the hallmarks or touchstones of his belief. Lewis, is best known as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia. But other people know, and many people don't know, that as a professor, Lewis was the most famous and influential authority on medieval and Renaissance English literature. He was such a popular lecturer at Oxford University, where, by the way, lectures are not required, that students would fill the halls, often sitting on the high windowsills and literally hanging from the rafters. He was a broadcaster. Many people don't know that his most famous book, Mere Christianity, at least one of the most famous books, were based upon Lewis's broadcasts that made, during World War II, his voice the second most recognized voice in England after Churchill's. He always wanted to be a poet, and he wrote poetry his whole life, both long and short. We'll be hearing some of that tonight. He trained as a philosopher, and his first teaching job was as a philosopher. Of course, we know him best as a Christian thinker and as a stalwart defender of the Orthodox faith, and that is where he got his commanding influence. Now, not so by the way, his interior life was as multidimensional as his career. So what about this work of Lewis? Why bother at all with C.S. Lewis? Well, he wrote 50 books during his lifetime, and many books came out after his death thanks to the hard work of Walter Hooper, who was his last secretary, an American who moved to Oxford and has worked tirelessly to bring out these books, 200 essays, lectures, and sermons, over 80 poems, both long and short, as I said, and in all of these, many, many types, fiction, nonfiction, fantasy, novels, lectures, sermons, broadcasts, he seems to have mastered each type of writing and speaking that he tried. We have the Chronicles of Narnia, of course, regarded as some of the greatest children's fantasy ever written. The Screwtape Letters, which got him on the cover of Time magazine and brought him international fame. Mere Christianity, which came out of those broadcasts and is responsible for very many conversions, most notably that of Charles Colson. But I know a friend who helped me found the New York C.S. Lewis Society, the late Father James Fisher, who converted from atheism to Christianity and to Catholicism and became a priest because of Mere Christianity. I wonder, do listeners know what's known as the Ransom Trilogy, named after the hero Elwin Ransom, who, among other places, confronts the horrific, appalling Unman who travels to Venus, known as Perilandra, to corrupt a world not yet fallen into original sin. Can Ransom prevent it? We will be visiting a bit of these in detail along the way in the weeks to come. But here's a small sample of Lewis's mind and imagination, his approach to mythology, and his storytelling style. It's from a poem, and it's called The Late Passenger. The sky was low, the sounding rain was falling dense and dark, and Noah's sons were standing at the window of the ark. The beasts were in, but Japheth said, I see one creature more, belated and unmated there, come knocking at the door. Well, let him knock, said Ham. Oh, let him drown or learn to swim. We're overcrowded as it is. We've got no room for him. And yet it knocks. How terribly it knocks, said Shem. Its feet are hard as horn, but oh, the air that comes from it is sweet. Now hush, said Ham. You'll waken Dad, and once he comes to see what's at the door, it's sure to mean more work for you and me. Noah's voice came roaring from the darkness down below. Some animal is knocking. Take it in before we go. Ham shouted back, and savagely he nudged the other two. That's only Japheth knocking down a brad nail in his shoe, said Noah. Boys, I hear a noise that's like a horse's hoof, said Ham. Why, that's the dreadful rain that drums upon the roof. Noah tumbled up on deck, and out he put his head. His face went gray. His knees were loosed. He tore his beard and said, "Look, look, it would not wait. It turns away. It takes its flight. Fine work you've made of it, my sons, between you all tonight. O noble and unmated beast, my sons were all unkind. In such a night, what stable and what manger will you find? O long shall be the furrows plowed across the hearts of men, before it comes to stable and to manger once again. And all the world, O Ham, may curse the hour when you were born. Because of you, this ark must sail without the unicorn." Well, it's a very dramatic poem, and as I said, it encapsulates much of C.S. Lewis's talent, his imagination, and his storytelling ability, and especially his taste for myth. But who was this man? Lewis was born November 29th, 1898, in Belfast, in the north of Ireland. He always thought of himself as an Irishman. He did not fetishize his cultural identity, but he didn't back away from it either, and it often influenced his work, especially in Narnia. He would die just a week short of his 65th birthday in 1963, on that fateful date, which I'm sure many of our listeners remember, the horrific day, November 22nd, on which President Kennedy was killed. The places that mark Lewis, besides Ireland, are, of course, Oxford University, where he spent almost all of his academic and personal life, and then Cambridge, where, without abandoning his house in Oxford, he would teach for the last 6 years of his professional life. The early events that mark him are first his atheism. He became an atheist before his teens and stayed an atheist until his 30s, actually. He went to war in World War I. He fought in the trenches. He was wounded. He took German prisoners, most of whom, by the way, so eager not to be captured by the French, just dropped their rifles and surrendered to Lewis, who didn't even draw his pistol. He just marched 80 soldiers into camp and, claimed them as prisoners of war. He became a tutor, that is a fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, in his very early 20s, first as a philosopher, and then as a tutor in English literature. He had a very successful career as a student, taking what's known as a triple first. After that came fame. In the mid-30s, he wrote his first academic book on medieval poetry, and it was a great success. And actually, in his middle to late 30s, became a very, very influential literary critic and historian. But then came the problem of Pain, a short book, and the Screwtape Letters. And fame, very, very great celebrity followed, including a cover for Time magazine and thousands of letters from people seeking Lewis's advice. And it's useful to know and telling to know that he answered every single one of those letters, often rising at 5 o'clock in the morning to do so. Just when Lewis thought he had nothing else to say or to write about before 1950, he's already in his early 50s. What happens? A great surprise to him and to those who knew him, the Chronicles of Narnia. Starting in 1950, and for every year until 56, one book came out to make the 7 in that collection. Along the way, his life was marked by friendship, close friends, called the Inklings, by the way. They would gather in a pub and read each other's work. And it's interesting to know that among these group of friends was J.R.R. Tolkien, who was writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and had no confidence in them. It was Lewis who encouraged Tolkien to keep writing because he thought they were a great treasure. But for Lewis, we would not have The Lord of the Rings. He took long walks. He was a great hiker over the English countryside, walks sometimes lasting 2 weeks. And, of course, he loved conversation, often lubricated by tea and especially ale. In the mid-50s, he married. An unlikely marriage. Some of you may have seen Shadowlands on Channel 13, PBS here, or in the movies. It's the story of his romance with Joy Davidman. I must say the movie version does not make me happy. It distorts too much. Joy Davidman was a Jewish woman who had become an atheist and then a Christian. largely owing to her correspondence with Lewis, born in the Bronx, New York. And their marriage surprised everyone, but Lewis indeed fell in love. The last 3 years of Lewis's life, he worked, he wrote, he didn't teach anymore, and after his death, after a short period of disinterest in Lewis, uninterest in Lewis, there came movies. The Chronicles of Narnia, for example, plays. Screwtape is a one-man show. The Great Divorce has been a one-man show. Some of you have heard of An Imagined Evening of Lewis Meeting Sigmund Freud. The Last Night of Freud's Life, which was off-Broadway here in New York, which in my opinion made Freud more famous, not Lewis. Documentaries came out. Now, all of this is very interesting. It's a full life, a rich life. But I would like to call attention to something which may strike some of you as unusual. I'm not being morbid when I say that there were 5 deaths in Lewis's life, that were turning points for him. The first of these was the death of his mother, Flora, in 1908, just before he was 10 years old. He described it as though it were a continent sinking beneath the sea. He was very close to his mother, who was a very educated woman, born in the middle of the 19th century in Ireland, had college degrees in math and logic, taught Lewis some French early on. And there's a funny story about Lewis as a 6-year-old. He announced to the world that he had a prejudice against the French. And his father asked, but Jaxie, as he liked to be called, his real name was Clive Staples, so you cannot be surprised that he preferred Jaxie and later Jack. Jaxie, why do you have a prejudice against the French? I don't know, said little Jaxie. If I knew that, it wouldn't be a prejudice, would it? Very precocious. When his mother dies, it's the beginning of his atheism, and he never really recovers from it. Anyone who has experienced this knows you can come to terms with such an event, but you never get over it. The second death was in 1929, and that was the death of his father, Albert. Lewis and his older brother, Warren, who was his best friend, 3 years older than Jack, called Warnie, or the Major because of his military service, did not get on well with Albert. He was kind of overbearing, a nice father, a good father, but garrulous. And Lewis treated him pretty badly, and later on would confess that he really didn't understand his father or try. But after Albert's death in 1929, Lewis's conversion begins. First to atheism, and then in 1931 to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, when Lewis is that telling age 33. In 1945, a man whom he loved as much as any other human being, Charles Williams, poet, philosopher, lay theologian, died at a relatively young age, just in his 50s, 59, I think. And Lewis said, when the idea of Charles Williams met the idea of death, it was the idea of death that changed. This was followed 6 years later by the death of a very interesting, somewhat mysterious woman, whom the Lewis brothers called Minto. Janie King Moore was the mother of a wartime buddy of C.S. Lewis's, Patty Moore, and the two boys, the two young men, had made a promise. If one were to die and the other survive, the survivor would take care of the dead mate's parents. Well, Patty Moore died in action, and Lewis inherited Mrs. Moore and, to a lesser degree, her very young daughter, Maureen Moore, and they cohabitated. Lewis would come to introduce her as his mother, but almost certainly, I mean, very, very near to certainty, they had some kind of sexual relationship when Lewis was in his young 20s and an atheist. Mrs. Moore would become a very, very difficult person, dying at the age of 79 in 1951. She had been in an asylum before that, so she was out of the household. And in his correspondence with an Italian priest, St. Giovanni Calabria, later to become blessed and saint, Lewis wrote, when Mrs. Moore died, that he had a strange feeling that his sins were forgiven and that for the first time he really believed that was the case. And then in 1960, Joy Davidman died, who was the romantic love of his life. What kind of man was C.S. Lewis? Listen to what one of his students had to say about him. This is John Wayne, not our movie star, but the professor of poetry at Oxford and a great biographer. He wrote in his biography of many people, including Lewis, "All these people I admired were dramatic personalities making a strong impact. Each had a characteristic style, not merely of writing or thinking, but a style of presenting himself to the outside world. They are always giving a performance in the role for which they have cast themselves, making up the play as they go along, and tacitly inviting others to collaborate. Such people are in fact fulfilling a moral duty. The Creator has equipped them with a certain identity, and they are all the time delightfully aware of this identity and out to get and to give as much fun as possible with it." Well, that's the kind of public man Lewis was. In private, he was the kind of man who loved pets dearly. He had cats almost all his life, and dogs, one Tim that he loved very much, and then Mr. Papworth. Now, in old age, as some of us are learning, we tend to get quirky, and Mr. Papworth was no exception to this. His quirks were that he could not eat standing still, or eat while anyone was watching. So 2 or 3 times a day, Lewis's neighbors on Kiln Lane, which was the lane that led up to the house known as the Kilns, where Lewis lived with his brother, they would see Professor Lewis walking down the lane, throwing dog food over his left shoulder. And behind him would be this little mangy hound walking along, probably ridden with arthritis, eating the food as it dropped to the ground without breaking stride. Every now and then, Lewis would stop and turn and look, and Papworth would stop and look around as though he were offended, and then Lewis would do the same thing walking back to his house. This, I like to imagine, was in the middle of a chapter of the Chronicles of Narnia, or some such thing. What did he think of his own work? Lewis, as I said, received much mail and became exceedingly popular, very, very celebrated, very, very influential, and remains very, very influential. But he was disturbed by the facility of his work, how easily it came to him, and thought at one point that he was starting to believe all of the things that people said about his work. He wrote the following poem about this near the end of his life, and it wasn't published until after his death. It's called The Apologist's Evening Prayer. "From all my lame defeats, and oh much more, from all the victories that I seem to score, from cleverness shot forth on thy behalf, at which while angels weep and the audience laugh, from all my proofs of thy divinity, thou who would give no sign, deliver me. Thoughts are but coins. Let me not trust, instead of thee, their thin, worn image of thy head. From all my thoughts, even from my thoughts of thee, O thou, fair silence, fall and set me free. Lord of the narrow gate and needle's eye, take from me all my trumpery, lest I die." Well, that's the kind of man C.S. Lewis was. And during the next few weeks, I'll tell another story or two about his life. But I would like to draw to an end tonight by calling attention to his thought. Remember, we talked about discussing his life, his work, and his thought. And pinpoint the single theme in Lewis, which is the most important. The one that he made the basis of his autobiography, which he called Surprised by Joy. He wasn't referring to his wife, Joy Davidman. He was referring to our longing for heaven, a desire so sharp and so poignant that it becomes painful and yet joyful because it reminds us of our real home. He says, in speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, which we find in ourselves even now, I feel a certain shyness. I am almost committing an indecency. We call it names like nostalgia and romanticism in adolescence. But really we cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. We cannot hide it, because our experience is constantly suggesting it, and we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of its name. I'll end with a poem by Lewis, which I've edited slightly, which captures this feeling. It's called The Day with a White Mark. C.S. Lewis on our longing for a home, which is heaven. All day I have been tossed and whirled in a preposterous happiness. Was it an elf in the blood, or a bird in the brain, or even part of the cloudily crested 50-league-long, loud, uplifted wave of a journeying angel's transit roaring over and through my heart? My garden spoiled. My holidays are canceled. The omens harden. The planned and unplanned miseries deepen. The knots draw tight. Reason kept telling me all day my mood was out of season. It was, too. In the dark ahead, the breakers are white. Yet I could have kissed the very scullery taps. The color of my day was like a peacock's chest. In at each sense there stole ripplings and dewy sprinkles of delight that with them drew fine threads of memory through the vibrant thickness of the soul. Who knows if it ever will come again, now the day closes? No one can give me or take away that key. All depends on the elf, the bird, or the angel. I doubt if the angel himself is free to choose when sudden heaven in man begins or ends.